Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Moira Fall and I am the Executive Director of NORRAG. And I'm thrilled to first of all introduce you to His Excellency Mr. Rui Macieira, who is the permanent representative of Portugal to the United Nations Office and other international organizations in Geneva, who will be giving us some opening remarks.
Dear Madam Special Rapporteur, Mrs. Kumba Boli Barry, dear members of the panel, thank you for the kind invitation to make the welcoming address at this important event. The right to education is a human right firmly rooted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and international legal instruments. It is one of the most powerful tools to lift children and adults out of poverty, and it is a stepping stone to other human rights. According to UNESCO, 258 million children and youth worldwide are still out of school for social, economic, and cultural reasons. States are the duty bearers under international human rights law and hold the principal responsibility for the provision of the right to education. Like all human rights, the right to education imposes levels of obligation on states to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to education. The obligations related to each of the essential features of the right to education are categorized under four known areas: availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability. States are also bound by the principles of non-retrogression. They should not take deliberate backward steps by adopting measures that will repeal or restrict existing guarantees of the right to education, and by allocating a maximum of their available resources. However, as highlighted in the Special Rapporteur's recent report, digital education may either enhance these essential features or jeopardize them. COVID led to a sudden mass deployment of online learning solutions, with many countries not equipped to ensure all students could pursue their education in this format without disruption. Digitalization of education can allow for more flexible and personalized learning processes and pathways and for educational innovation. But it also demands changes in the way education management systems are conceived and students' competencies evaluated. Digital education is not without risks of data privacy and protection, in particular the protection of children from violence, sexual exploitation, and abuse. Finally, the digital divide, with the unequal distribution of access to technology and connectivity, presents further risks to the students' well-being, as highlighted by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in its General Comment number 25 of March 2021. As stated in the European Union-led joint statement on educational and digital agenda, the digital transformation provides unique opportunities to accelerate the achievement of SDG 4 on ensuring access to inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. Yet, this digital transformation needs to be governed by human rights and stem from a commitment to promote economic, social, and cultural rights in respect of the principles of universality, indivisibility, interdependence, and interrelatedness of all human rights. Digitalization of education must not increase inequalities or lead to violations of other human rights within education. In Portugal's National Action Plan for Digital Transition 2020, the aim is for all students, teachers, and schools to collaborate, teach, and learn in a digital environment by providing digital platforms and access to digital education resources. In fact, each school will establish an action plan for digital development. We hope that this approach will encourage digital inclusion, promote gender equality in the digital world, and prepare students for an increasingly digital labor market while minimizing the impact of COVID-19 in schools. Therefore, it is a great honor to support this event, and we wish you a very fruitful, insightful, and informative discussion in this crucial topic for the future of education. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very clear introduction as to the importance, urgency, and also relevance of the discussion that we're having today on the digitalization and its impacts on the right to education. So the phrase digital education or digital learning in English The digital always comes before the education, before the learner. And the experts that we have gathered together here today are very much counseling against this prioritization. Education and learning are the goal, and digital tools may support reaching that goal. They may support it more or less in certain ways and certain contexts, but not others, for certain learners at certain ages, but not others. And these are the critical issues that we're going to be discussing today. And I am very, very pleased to bring together this panel of experts and also the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education, Dr. Kumbuboli Barry, who presented her report specifically on that, her 2022 report on digitalization and its impacts on the right to education yesterday at the Human Rights Council here in Geneva. And I'm thrilled that she's here with us today to be able to give us an overview of that report before we then go into the discussion with our experts. Dr. Bolibari, the floor is yours.
Bonjour, Moira. C'est toujours un plaisir.
Hello, Maura. It's always a great pleasure, a shared pleasure to meet with you again, as well as the whole team. Your Excellency, Ambassador of Portugal, ladies and gentlemen, dear experts, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, representative of the civil society. Before giving you the floor, I'd like to thank His Excellency, the Ambassador of Portugal. Thank you very much for having taken part in the momentum and for also having supported us all through our mandate. You were always there and have provided some support. So thank you so much. Thank you for your help in providing the momentum in the field of promoting education for all. And it's very important to stress this. I also wish to express my gratitude to Laura, because the report was also made possible thanks to the dynamic support and to the expertise and the competence of Moira. On behalf of myself, I'd like to thank NORRAG. I'd like to thank Moira. Thank you so much for this support all through this endeavor. And I also wish to congratulate the team, Mylène Bidot in particular, who was there on a daily basis, who has brought all the relevant people together and who has been extremely helpful in providing the momentum. I'd like to thank Mr. Stig. That was at the very beginning of my mandate, of my term. I also wish to thank Tezo and Kagada, of course, who has always been a major player in the human coordination. I just wanted to point out that it was a sort of group realization, a lot of people involved. Of course, the network of the civil society, Switzerland played a major role, but other countries from other continents, Africa, Americas, Oceania, Asia. Well, thank you so much. You were all very present. And do continue asking the civil society to be very active. They are doing a fantastic work. And I'd like to congratulate them and encourage them to go further. As far as the report is concerned, let me say that it was very welcome yesterday. There were 100 comments, well, actually 88 to be precise, 88 comments from the states, but also from part of the civil society organization. It was fantastic to see how interested people were in the whole world were interested in the digitalization and the impact of digitalization on the right to education. Now, what I would like to share with the various experts are the conclusions of my report. I think it is important also to point out that the first report, which I had prepared during the COVID period, had already come up with a very strong recommendation, i.e., the approach to adopt was to make sure that education is available for every human being, i.e., any citizen on this planet must have access to education. And I'm talking about highly inclusive education, good quality education, free education, public education. This is, generally speaking, the overall approach, which is certainly the most important aspect to take into consideration. It really is one utmost objective: make sure that the states provide free education, quality education, inclusive education, and public education, and that should be provided to all citizens in this world, boys and girls, men and women. It's something we have to remember and repeat again and again. As far as I am concerned, the highlights of the report are as follows. What needs to be highlighted is to say that problems are due to digitalization. Yes, there are issues, there are problems linked to digitalization. And the situation is very similar in all countries. As a matter of fact, most countries following the COVID pandemic have actually quite hastily taken measures in order to use digital tools, computers and other tools, in order to implement digitalization. Now, some countries have managed better than others. And essentially, we're all involved in long life learning today, or learning by doing. So what I was trying to say was that we tend to expect from digital tools that they will solve all problems. Now, that is certainly wrong, because digitalization, digital tools are only tools. You need to have an approach focused on the right to education, and unless your approach is right to education focused, all digital tools will be useless. Then, generally speaking, at all levels, we see that there are a lot of attempts, a lot of pressure being exerted on behalf of digital companies, and they may have other interests which do not coincide with the interests of teachers, of learners. So let us all resist to this pressure. We need to take into consideration that the use of digital tools is essential, is crucial, but we also need to react, and that is still lacking. Of course, some digital companies will highlight the advantages of their digital tools, but we notice in reality that sometimes this is not in line with what we observe. We're talking about, for example, issues relating to data confidentiality, relating to students or to learners and to teachers. We have to be very careful. We have to keep our eyes open, and we have to realize that any investment in digital tools means also investing in the teaching profession. We have to empower them. We need to enable them to use tools that they will create themselves. And we also need to determine who will be paying the bill at the end? Do you want something which is free and cheap? This is going to be paid by the children and their parents because it will be actually a violation of their private rights. Now we have choices to make, and the e-trade has increased difficulties. We observe today that digitalization is very present in schools and education. Now, let us be careful because there are too many commercial services, marketing services. I stress that word. And we have observed that this is the trend in education services. Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, dear experts, we are all worried about the increase of inequalities due to the increased use of digital tools in education. And there are risks. Of course, there are potential advantages, but there are potential risks as well. In fact, exclusion is being increased. Standardization is being increased, rather a more personal education. It's really important to respect diversity. We see that creativity might not be enhanced as much. The exploitation of data for just a few people rather than for a greater number. This is something which presents a risk. We need to address all these risks. And we realize that only some privileged parts of the society will take advantage of the digital tools. And that is where we have to put our foot down. The idea is not to continue providing advantages to those who are already privileged. We need to move on towards more inclusiveness. We need to move on to equal opportunities. In another area, digital education could become a cheap way of providing education at all levels. Now, this is possibly true, but what about creativity? What about taking part in society's life? This is something we need to address. There are many links between cultural right on the one hand and right to education on the other hand. All of this needs to be into consideration, and I have made some recommendations. For example, the introduction of digital technologies should be learner and teacher focused. It must also be age adapted. There are the 4 A's: availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability. Education for all, as His Excellency the Ambassador mentioned earlier. The reinforcement, the strengthening of education for all. So we need to make sure that all have to actually become part of the society, citizens of society. And this was especially noted by UNESCO in its declaration. We need to make sure to protect the right to education, the right to information, and the right to cultural rights. And I'd like to thank Mrs. Colabulgué within UNESCO, and I'd like to thank her team as well. She needs to certainly continue her work. Full abidance to the rights of non-discrimination, such as other rights, such as the right of opinion, the right of expression, the right to information, various freedom, the right to privacy, the right to health and good food. Generally speaking, we need to develop some laws so that the children's confidentiality and privacy is protected. This is true also for teachers, but also for learners. Education in a digital way must be developed, taking into consideration the cultural rights of human beings, taking into consideration their aspirations, their needs, but also their resources and their capacities. we need also to take into consideration issues relating to ethnicity, disability, an intersectional approach. We have to see whether you're living in a city, in a rural area, whether you're a refugee, whether you're a migrant worker, whatever, all those aspects need to be taken into consideration, and we have to provide some support to students when they use digital tools. These digital tools are there to reduce the discrepancies. As to the freedom provided, it should be applied both to students, to learners, and to teachers. We have to make sure that increasingly a lot of people can take part in the decision-making process and take part on decisions concerning the digital tools. And of course, the private sector. I'm referring here to the Abidjan guiding principles, but I'm also referring to human rights and to the rights of companies. And finally, the platforms, the digital infrastructures need to be free. In order to better support education, we need to provide different tools which will actually enable to have more free educational resources. Your Excellency, Ambassador, Madam, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of the civil society, ladies and gentlemen, experts from all fields, once again, it was a great pleasure to share this with you. I'd like to thank once again all the countries which I visited during my mandate. I'd like to thank all actors, all players, the civil society, my own country, of course, and more specifically other countries which supported me, like Switzerland, Niger, Côte d'Ivoire, which are countries which have provided a lot of support throughout my efforts and which have made it easier for me to carry out my term. I thought it was very important to stress that. Thank you to all, and it is always a very great pleasure to continue this discussion. And of course, we will certainly meet again even after this mandate in order to continue this fight, which is a fight for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kumba, for being here today and sharing the wisdom of that report that was presented yesterday to the Human Rights Council. So now we are going to move on to a panel discussion with some of the experts that informed the Special Rapporteur's report. And we will start first of all with a researcher and advocate of the Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, Hye-Chan Han. And so Han, you led the research for the publication of Human Rights Watch's Global Report on Online Learning and Children's Data Privacy, which was released in May. Can you tell us more about the main findings of this research, please?
Sure, and a warm hello to everyone on this call, and thank you, Madame Bolibari, Maura, Mylène, everyone on this call for creating such strong work for this report to come out. So what we did at Human Rights Watch, we did a global investigation of the education technologies, otherwise known as EdTech. So these are apps and websites that kids were using for online learning that were recommended by 49 of the world's most populous countries in the world. Now that's a little bit of a big sentence, so let me try to break that down a little bit. So I examined 163 products around the world, and in the process ended up investigating around 300 companies around the world. And what that means is I actually cracked open the code of 163 apps and websites that governments had recommended for kids, peered inside and looked at how these products were, what kinds of information they were collecting from children, how they were collecting it, and then importantly, who they were sending children's data to. And the other maybe explanatory thing I'll say for everyone here is it's important to note that I deliberately started this research in March of 2021. So a full year after the pandemic began, because I think, as Madame Boliberi mentioned, I think it all feels like yesterday for us at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, where governments were just responding in a crisis and rushing to connect students and learners to some form of online learning if they had access to internet. So we didn't want to penalize governments for making the best decision they could in a horrible crisis situation. But what we did want to do is look at how governments were making decisions to connect children to safe online classrooms and how they were thinking about children's data and privatization and all of the themes that are mentioned in the Special Rapporteur's report from yesterday. Okay, so let me talk about some of the findings. The overwhelming majority, so 89% of all of the products we looked at infringed or violated children's rights in one way or the other. Of the 49 countries we looked at, which is also important to mention that this spanned the entire globe, every single continent, from the poorest to the richest of countries, from war-torn Iran and Iraq to the global north, like Australia and Canada and the United States. Every single country, except for one, which was Morocco, endorsed at least one product for their country's children that infringed upon their rights. So what does that mean, to infringe or violate upon kids' rights in this space? So like I said, I looked at what it was all about, what kinds of data they were collecting from children, how they were collecting it, and who they were sending it to. So let's think about the first bucket for a moment. Sometimes it was something about the type of information they were collecting from children that was extremely sensitive personal data. So as an example of the mobile apps I looked at, many of these apps were able to collect what's called precise GPS location data. Now, I know that's a very technical term, and it means that these apps through your mobile phone or a child's mobile phone can figure out the exact coordinates of a child roughly to an accuracy about 5 meters or so. Now, to translate that into real world language, what that means is, if you'll remember at the beginning of the pandemic, we were all, in all of our respective countries, we were all in lockdown in our homes. And especially children were not really traveling or moving outside of their homes because parents wanted to keep them safe. So that meant that suddenly these apps were able to start figuring out where children lived, and even to the point of where their bedrooms are, where their living rooms are, where they're spending the most time at home. So this is the kind of extremely sensitive personal data that was being sucked up by these edtech products, generally without the knowledge or the consent of either children or their caregivers or teachers as well. Now let's look at the second bucket. Something about how these products were collecting children's data that infringed on their rights to privacy and other rights. So some of these technologies are so insidious that even if the caregiver or the guardian of the child had a world-class PhD in information security and was a world-class hacker, right? Someone very experienced in computers, there was no way for them to guard their child against some of these surveillance technologies. And yes, I say surveillance technologies because this is how persistent this kind of surveillance was. So to give you an example of what that means, some of these technologies, the moment that the child opened a website or opened an app on their phone, this tracking technology embedded itself in the child's, whatever the child was using as their device, whether that's an app or a tablet or a computer. And there's actually no way to protect against it or guard against that without having to throw away the phone or the computer in the trash altogether. Again, that's how persistent these tracking technologies are. And the fact that they were weaponized and used against children is certainly a grave violation and infringement of their rights, considering that these products were intended to deliver children with education and nothing more. Now let's turn to the third bucket of things that I was looking at, which is who children's data were being sent to. So I mentioned at the beginning of this speech here that I examined and investigated close to 300 companies around the globe. And the majority of children's data were being sent to advertising technology companies. And essentially these companies, they suck in people's personal data everywhere around the world. And their algorithms start trying to make guesses based on this data. They try to guess at the child and who the child is behind that screen. So a child might be spending their time on a learning website, and the kinds of data that that website is collecting and transmitting to these companies say, based on this information and based on this data, we guess that this is a child between 13 and 15, lives in Niger, lives in this particular city or this particular neighborhood, is really interested in this kind of sports, not interested in robots, starts to try to guess at who this child is, and crucially, how this child might be manipulated. Because the point of all of this data processing is to be able to then manipulate and influence, in this case, a child into their future behaviors, whether that's asking their parents to purchase something online for them, or even to influence their views and thoughts based on the kinds of information that are then served up to them on the internet, based on these algorithms and who they think this child is and what they're likely to be interested in. So it's not just the child's right to privacy, it also starts infringing upon their child's right to access of information and potentially also freedom of thought as well. And then maybe the very last thing I will say here is it's important to know that children had no meaningful way to consent. So I think all of us here as adults, we've all had this experience of talking to our friends about that new car we would love to buy one day, or that new pair of shoes, and suddenly having advertisements follow us across the internet. Well, for children and for education, it's different. The fact that governments recommended these products, and by the way, very few, if not no governments, bother to actually do their due diligence to check whether the edtech products they were recommending were safe for children to use. So throughout this research, I also saw the lack of responsibility of governments in their right to uphold children's rights. But here, what's happening is that for children, you either had to use the edtech product that your school or your government told you to use, or you were marked as not attending school that day or not submitting your homework. And so your grades would suffer as a result, or maybe you might have to drop out of school. There was no meaningful alternative for them to access their right to education without submitting to whatever products that these governments recommended. And the other thing I will mention here is that it's important that forget about COVID and forget about digitalization just for a moment. Every government, every Ministry of Education there is a cost associated to delivering what we believe is necessary, which is free, equitable, adaptable education, as Madame Boliberchi said. But when it came to COVID-19 and online education, suddenly these products were offered to governments for free. They did not have to pay for the provision of online education. But as we know, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Someone had to pay for the provision of these services. And so what ended up happening was that children were unwittingly compelled to give up their privacy and their other rights in order to pay for their online education because governments weren't doing that. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Maura.
Thank you so much. And what is it that your recommendations are? What should states and schools do to ensure children's rights to privacy when using digital tools in education, particularly where, as you say, sometimes there is no meaningful consent to be given, there is no consent at all?
I think the single most biggest thing that can be done to protect kids online, whether that's in online classrooms or on the internet, is for every government to pass modern child data protection laws. That's a little bit of a mouthful. Let me just break that down for 30 seconds. So there are some government, I did a mapping of the countries that I covered, and there are some governments that have old data protection laws written at a time when the internet looked very different in the 80s than what it does now. And of course, there are many governments that don't have data protection laws, let alone ones specific to children. Now, I think everyone here working in the realm of children's rights and protecting children knows that children are entitled to specific protections regarding their privacy. And we need laws and regulations that will not only hold companies to account, but also governments to protecting children's privacy in the online realm, whether that's specific to education or otherwise.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your contribution today and also to the expert consultations that we convened for the Special Rapporteur as well. Moving on now to Neil Selwyn, who's the Distinguished Professor in the Faculty of Education of Monash University. Neil, large amounts of data are generated through the increased use of digital technologies for education. What kind of data are generated and by whom?
Thanks for the question, Maura, and thanks for inviting me to this very, very kind of prestigious event. Yeah, data is a key element of all digital education. So the increased use of digital technologies in education result in the increased production and circulation and processing of data. And at the same time, the key technologies in education that we're very excited about, such as AI, are data-driven. So when we talk about the datafication of education, we are talking about digital technologies. And there's at least 4 different ways I think that digital technologies are increasing data in education, and they're very distinct, and we need to pay attention to each one in turn. The first is trace data, what the previous panelist was talking about. So data is constantly being generated in the background from the devices and the software that is being used in classrooms. This data relates to how the technology is being used, so keystrokes, clicks, swipes, likes. Now, this data is routinely extracted by software providers to improve their products. It's an intrinsic part of software development. But as the previous panelist was saying, it's also routinely sold to commercial data brokers and third parties involved in the data economy, what Shoshana Zuboff terms surveillance capitalism. So that's one form of data. A second form of data at the same time is learning analytics and education data mining products. Now, this is the deliberate generation of large-scale data from the use of classroom technologies with the explicit aim of inferring insights about learning and teaching, which can then be fed back to teachers, students, and administrators. So we're seeing the rise of data dashboards and data reports and data-driven decision-making on the form of students and teachers. But also we have 2 other forms of data that's also interesting. Teachers are using technologies to generate small scale data relating to their own classrooms. So they're using polls and quizzes and surveys just to kind of inform what they do. And last of all, we shouldn't forget that digital technologies are a key part of the generation and the circulation of system level standardized measures and metrics like PISA, NAPLAN, and other standardized assessments. So all these different forms of data and data practices are very distinct, and they've got very different implications and issues.
Thank you. And what are some key issues around how these data are currently being used?
So I'm not negative. I want to be positive. I'm not anti-data. So this data can be used for all sorts of interesting things in terms of teaching and learning. But I have a few concerns. I'm sure we all do. First of all, I'm worried that the vast majority of data that could be of use is currently being underused in schools. Most of the data being generated by school systems and school platforms and classroom software remains accessible only to the platform providers. Most schools are unaware of how data is being used and could be used. And even when this data is accessible, it's often hampered by technical issues of what we call interoperability, different data sets being able to be compatible and used with each other. And also in most schools, data is only really being used by a small group of teachers with prior skills and experience. If we're being honest, data use is not widespread in most education settings. Secondly, I'm worried actually that what can be represented through digital data remains limited in its scope and its representativeness. There is many important aspects, I think, of teaching and learning and education that are unquantifiable and cannot be captured through data. Third, I'm also worried about the ways in which data is beginning to undermine professional expertise of teachers. We're seeing teachers now having to teach in ways that fit with the data, that show up in the data, teaching in algorithmically visible ways. And we're also seeing a reduction in teachers' capacities to explain or actually to be held accountable for the database decisions that are arising from technologies in their own classrooms. And just a couple of other things that I'm slightly worried about. The rise of, well, the previous speaker talked about surveillance. I would call it dataveillance, database surveillance. These digital technologies lend themselves really well to the monitoring of students, what we might call surveillance pedagogy. And also these digital technologies lend themselves to kind of crude managerial uses of data to judge teacher performance. And lastly, as the previous panelist was saying, that the third-party scraping of data is a real problem. I'm not surprised the Human Rights Watch audit found 89% of endorsed education technologies to be selling student data. That's the dominant business model of most digital technologies. If you're not paying for the product, you are the product. So I don't want to say that data is a bad thing, but there are lots of reasons to be cautious and perhaps lots of reasons to think differently.
Thank you. And so what would your main recommendations be to ensure that data are used for the public good and for enhancing people's right to education?
Well, it's wonderful to make recommendations as an academic. I don't have to implement any of them. You can say governments need to do this, but actually I think government should play a wider role or a more active role in possibly having some form of oversight, some form of national oversight about how digital technologies are being implemented in schools, particularly in terms of ensuring compliance with relevant data regulations. We might see some form of EdTech regulation agency, for example. I think we can have nationally enforced standards, or maybe even kind of more global enforced standards for education data interoperability to allow easier exchange and reuse of education data between different systems. Within schools, I think there is a space for critical data literacy components of school curricula, not just data literacy, but critical data literacy, having a critical understanding of all the issues I've just raised, and indeed in teacher education. I would love to see educators encouraged to take up open data and non-proprietary data tools that are not for profit, that encourage kind of common stewardship rather than individual ownership of data. And last of all, if you can imagine what could be done with all the data that's generated within school classrooms and university classrooms within a country, within a region, it would be wonderful to pool it all together in some form of national data commons or open data repositories to allow for the collaborative use of data that's generated within education systems. So I think there are definitely some really interesting examples and ideas for better practice out there. We just have to have the know-how and the kind of wherewithal to start doing it.
Thank you very much for that, Neil. Just a reminder to participants, please do put your questions in the chat. Janet, would you like to come up next, please?
Hi, everyone. My name is Janet Kwame. I'm associate professor at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm originally from Ghana, West Africa, but I've been in the States for close to 17 years. So it's my second home. My research focuses really on the area the intersection of gender, information, communication technologies, and development in the global South. And so a lot of my work really focused on marginalized communities and how they use digital technologies. A lot of my research focused on digital inequities and how do we address digital inequities. So today I'll be talking more about those issues from the perspective of gender. So I'm just going to share from my perspective that looks at gender issues with regards to digital inequities, and really looking at it in terms of sharing the kind of overview in the field of ICT for D. I'm going to talk specifically with regard to some of the main issues that the study, that my field discusses when it comes to this issue of diversity and inclusion in education, when it comes to digitization of education. So one of the core points that I want to, and again, I'm going to draw out some of the main issues, stems from the fact that within the field itself, there is a focus on the idea of intersectionality, applying an intersectional lens in looking at digitization and education. And so really drawing on Kimberly Cresher's work, but she's not the only one. Marilyn Fry had done the work about the metaphor of the bird cage as well, that talks about really these different spaces of oppression that people find themselves in and the need for us to acknowledge them. So this intersectional framework therefore considers gender, ethnicity, religion versus rural versus urban location and other intersections that could affect how students and teachers bring to the experiences in terms of digitization, and therefore the ways in which technology may widen rather than reduce digital inequalities. And so it's very important to consider gender variables that might exacerbate digital inequity within that context. And so this approach to research helps us to understand how identities from race, gender, class, sexuality really intersect with these power structures within society, because the challenge is that often we do not acknowledge power as inherently part and parcel of technological interventions. And it's really important for us to pay attention to that. So this matrix that exists really acknowledges that the power at the center that privileges certain groups and others that are marginalized. And it's important that when we're thinking about a framework of digitizing education, we acknowledge those are the margins and make sure that we're designing programs in a way that acknowledges them and reaches them. So that is one point that I want to raise with regards to that. How are they affected? Because often failure to interrogate power is detrimental to marginalized groups, be them women, indigenous group, people of color, differently abled, lower income. So we must seek to create a more digitally inclusive society. Within the literature, I will draw out three main areas and just focus on one. So we have this area in which there's digital inequity that plays a role with digitization of education, but there's also bias that is inherent in the technology. And I think Abiba and Amelia both mentioned that in their presentation. So the technology itself is embedded with a lot of bias that needs to be addressed. And then the broader issue of lack of diversity. Who is speaking for whom? And who are those making decisions about whom? Whose voice is included in this whole process? Are we looking at a system where it's corporatized, whereby corporations are calling the shots, or those in the global north versus those in the global south? So those are elements that we want to pay attention to. Within this context also, we have to think about the cultural dimensions with regards to access and use. And the literature does draw about a lot of digital inequalities. That is not just one. We used to have this language of a digital divide. The literature is showing a shift away from this idea of there's an absolute divide, and showing that the divide actually is like a pendulum. Depending on where you are, you might experience different types of divides. And so we need to acknowledge them. Yes, access is at the first level. People still do not have access to technologies, let alone go to school. We see that in COVID, where a lot of kids, when schools were closed out, lost a lot of man hours or school time. And so access becomes one, but internet usage is also capabilities becomes one. And then another level they talk about is this idea of this third level of tangible outcomes. Who is benefiting? And we realize that it replicates what is happening offline. So if I come from a home with a well-educated mother and a good job and all that, I'm likely to have more tangible outcomes than somebody else who doesn't have that and has to do, low menial jobs and does not even have time to understand the technology that is being taught the children. So within that, the literature does draw out some key barriers, affordability, access, adoption, bias, and stereotyping that we need to pay attention to. And then certain dynamics that impact inclusion, infrastructure. If we're going to say that we're going to have a digitization of education, who is defining the infrastructure? Is it private organizations? Is it government? Is it stakeholders? Who is in charge of the infrastructure? And those require some technical changes and shifts. We need to look for models that is more inclusive than what we have right now. I like that Emmeline talked about the fact that we have to think about the technologies that we can have, not what we have. And so what we have currently do not have embedded things that benefit people. A good example is a lot of my kids spend time on YouTube. And within YouTube are so many ads, within YouTube are predators. There's so many that is not good. So as a mother, because I know about these things, I can police my children to steer away from certain content. Unfortunately, children that are in marginalized communities don't have that policing and therefore pick up things like pornography and other things that really do not help their growth. And so issues around market and regulation are all within my literature to address. And then when we're thinking about digital inclusion, as a result, we have to think about it in these different aspects in terms of access, in terms of adoption, in terms of application. Adoption is about digital literacy. What kind of training do people have? Not just those going to school, the teachers, the student, but their families. Because when we're talking about digitization of education, it's not contained within the classroom. It goes outside of the classroom. And so we need to acknowledge that. Then the applications itself. Who controls the application? Do we have freeware, software? And there's a lot of platforms and they are selling it for very expensive pricing. So who will have access to certain platforms and who doesn't? So those are broader questions that we have to think about. We also have to think about in terms of really all these levels that I've talked about, and I don't have as much time. We have to think about inclusive resources, addressing the economic, cultural aspect. What kind of cultural content is available? Is it something that is couched within the Western perspective and brought down to other cultures? So the cultural context becomes very important. What about local languages? How are those embedded in there? We talk about digital skills within the context of the culture as well. So we need to talk about the cultural dimensions that are inherent in there. And then we want to talk about issues about when we're thinking about inclusion, we're thinking about strategies that would eliminate historical, institutional, and structural barriers that have existed. How do we ensure that we have a system in place that allows for equal participation? And I've addressed some 6 elements in here, thinking about how much does it cost in terms of infrastructure, whether it's equitable, internet access, the idea of literacies, humane and ethical technology, the ethics of these technologies. A lot of these technologies are not ethical. They are collecting data of ordinary citizens. They have no control whatsoever. And then application and content designed to enable and encourage self-sufficiency. There tends to be more of a dependency model when it comes to technology, especially for those in the global South. And we need to kind of move away from those tendencies. Then finally, to think about it more broadly in terms of education towards a digital citizenship. What are these different elements? How do they come together so that we can think about education more holistically? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Janet.
Right, so next, I'm very pleased to welcome Janja Komjenovic, who is the director of the Center for Higher Education Research and Evaluation at Lancaster University in the UK. So Janja, you argue that the digitalization of education should be understood as part of a new wave of privatization. Can you tell us more about how you understand privatization in education, please?
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. So typically, we would understand privatization in education in two main ways, I would say. So first, it would be the expansion of private providers and the rise of tuition fees. And the second, it would be introducing so-called market forces into the public education systems with the idea to modernize the governance. So this would mean introducing competition, rankings, key performance indicators, efficiencies, and so on, with the aim to make education better. So these would be the main ways scholars conceptualize privatization over the past few decades, very broadly speaking. But now, with the fast digitalization of the sector, we notice new dynamics, and I will highlight only three things here, although there's more to say. So first, schools and universities digitalize with a variety of digital platforms and digital infrastructure. And some of these might be public or open source, but the bulk of it in most places around the world would most likely be proprietary. And in such a case, deprivatization becomes structural and long-term. So because changing an institutional digital infrastructure is incredibly timely and costly, institutions would be financially and legally locked in to a particular digital ecosystem. And then these are governed by terms of use that are issued by platforms and by private contracts that individual institutions manage to negotiate with the platform owners. And they are in very different market power positions in negotiations. And students and staff must use this infrastructure for their studies or work. They have no choice, as the first speaker explained so well. So I think this is something really different than when we use platforms for our leisure, social media and such by our own choice. Second, the majority of the most valued and biggest edtech companies work in the so-called consumer markets. So this means that they provide services directly to individuals. And at the lower levels of education, it would mean building parallel systems to schools, such as tutoring or innovating various learning apps. And parents would typically pay different kinds of subscription fees. And at the post-secondary level of education, this would mean addressing lifelong learning and skills training directly through platforms and all sorts of new micro and nano credentials. And this perhaps with the idea of even replacing or at least profoundly challenging and changing universities. And they are set to be too costly, inefficient, and not delivering for the needs of the labor market. So it seems that there is a totally new global market emerging in tech-based lifelong learning, catering to individuals and challenging what we knew as institutionalized education. And then finally, edtech is a way to capitalization of education. So we notice an incredibly fast rise in financial investment in edtech specifically. So historically, investors were really not that keen on investing in education because the sector was seen as too complicated, nationally specific, low potential for return on investment, as well as a lot of opposition and counter movements to privatization. But now edtech promises high yields. So edtech is one of the sectors with the fastest rising increase in investment. Just as an example, Holon IQ, which is the edtech market intelligence platform, reports that the sector started with 500 million of venture capital 10 years ago in 2010 and reached 20 billion only last year alone in 2021. And there is also a rise in the number of edtech unicorns, so companies valued at more than $1 billion, and even companies that went public. And since 2016, and especially since 2020, we also notice a rise in acquisitions in the sector and potentially monopoly tendencies. So kind of emerging really big edtech in a sense. And these patterns resemble that of other economic sectors and how other economics and social sectors digitalize. And education is therefore embedded in the digital economy more broadly via edtech, with potentially similar trends and consequences than in the other economic sectors.
Thank you. And in your view, the current privatization process should be understood as one of assetization. What is this and what's the impact on the right to education?
Right, so assetization is a process of turning things into assets. And assets could be very simply put, understood as resources that bring value to the owner in the future. But the owner keeps the control and follow-through rights. So imagine a typical digital platform for which we pay a subscription fee. As digital users, we do not get to change the platform, copy it, sell it, decide how it works, who can use it, and so on. But the owner of the platform does. So the platform owner decides who gets to access, under what conditions, as well as what happens on the platform. They can also decide to sell the platform with all the existing data with it. And therefore, the temporality of what happens with the product and with our data that we put in is in question all the time. So examples of assets in the digital economy might be content, such as classes or lectures, platforms as such, as a form of software that issue terms of use and are protected by a license, user data that has the potential to be made valuable, and this was already talked about before, algorithms, probably more and more so, and other data-rich operations if they're really specific and valuable for the actual service of the particular platform, and even brands, university brands or platform brands. And based on my research, it seems that at least at the higher education level, digital technology was mostly used to expand the education provision, such as via MOOCs or OPMs. OPMs are online program management platforms. Or digital technology was used for digitizing content, such as virtual learning environments. And it seems that this was like the first generation platforms. And only now we are seeing a search for the value in digital user data and other assets, and lots of experimentation happening. I agree with Neil that at the moment, data is not really utilized that much, but the search is definitely on. So we see the experimentation in how these digital artifacts could be made valuable and monetized. But the search is, as I'm saying, is definitely on. And we see this at least in the discourses that the edtech industry constructs and promises personalization, automation, and overall disruption in education.
Thank you so much, Janja. So we will now go to the questions that we have received. One of those questions is from, let me just find the right name, Tahsin Sayed, who was a former director with the World Bank, and he's asking about inequalities. And so I just wanted to share with you the fact that in the publication that we have coming out soon, we have a policy insights briefing that we will be releasing very soon. And there's a whole section in that briefing which is on diversity, digital divides, and digital education. And do notice the use of the plural, digital divides. There are several of them. And we have 4 different authors who have written very insightful pieces on these digital divides and what it is that that we will be that needs to be done in those spaces. Right. Then we also have a question here from Edemosai, which is asking, so for low-income countries that are embracing open schooling policies, how do we envisage the role of EdTech in ensuring qualitative learning, particularly given the challenges of poverty that face such a learner profile? Janja, Neil, or Han, do you have any insights on that? Open schooling, dealing with roaming schools or mobile classrooms?
If I can start,
Please.
if you like. It's really important when we talk about EdTech to think about context. So context is really, really important. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. So I think anything that works in a particular local context has to be locally kind of planned and developed. And this idea of appropriate technology, I think, is very, very important in terms of digital technologies. So there are plenty of ways that we can use technologies in low and middle income contexts, but it has to come from local educators, local communities that fit with local contexts. And it was really interesting to see the technology that really worked during the COVID remote schooling shutdowns, particularly in low and middle income countries. We saw prepaid mobile, dumb phones, for example. We saw radio, we saw television, we saw paper-based resources, and we saw some digital technology. But it's completely different. So there's no one solution that we can recommend, but I think there are definite lessons that we know. But context is so important. And the context of low and middle income countries is completely different to a lot of the education systems that we've all just been talking about. So it's a really good question.
So OIDEL is another partner organization that has been very supportive of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the right to education. And we're very pleased to have Ignacy Grau to say some words on behalf of OIDEL. Please, Ignacy.
First of all, thank you all for the presentations, for all the presentations of the speakers. As it was said, I'm the director of OIDEL, which is an NGO with consultative status before the UN. Digitalization and the exposure to screens is just not a neutral enterprise. Once again, today we have had another example of that. And at this point, we know two things. First, that an unequal access to technology could lead to a lack of inclusivity in the field of education, but also we have to remember that quality and the way children are submitted to technology also can have an important impact on the realization of the right to education and other rights, not only on the right to education. This is why I think this report has been really important, because the best way to deal with the issue of digitalization is through a humanistic and through a human rights approach. Indeed, the human rights approach and the societal and cultural dimension of the right to education is crucial, we think, to deal with the issue of technologies. From this perspective, education is not just a mere deposition of content. And as stressed by the Special Rapporteur, educational settings as such are places of interaction between all members of the educational community, namely teachers, parents, learners, families, and communities. In this regard, we would like to make just two remarks. First, it is essential to recall that children learn more and better from human interactions and real sensorial experience than from the mere exposure to screens. And we tend sometimes to forget, and it's important also to, it has been said, I think, today, but that the fact that the child is overstimulated does not mean that he's actually learning. Also, an important issue here is the role of parents. Digitalization plays a critical role, not only in formal education, but also in informal education. And many civil society actors have shown that in order for policies in the field of digitalization to be successful, it is important that they consider parents and communities so they are also culturally relevant. Yeah, well, I was also thinking here of launching a question. We've been talking a lot of privatization, but at the end, between the child and the state, there are many other actors that play an important role to make sure that this digitalization can be implemented from a good cultural perspective. My comment here is, here in one side, parent, which is a non-state actor, and also civil society organizations and civil society schools, like I see here a representative of Waldorf Steiner, but also we could call Montessori, some faith-based schools who are playing an important role on dealing with two issues. Shouldn't we be talking more of education as a public good rather than emphasizing so much sometimes the idea of the right of public education as it is expressed in the report? Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for that provocation and that question. Unfortunately, given the time, we don't have the possibility of answering it right now. And we will certainly make sure that we are in touch with Grant to have his comments added to the video that will be sent to all participants in the first week of July. Kumba, would you like to say any final words before we leave? And then I have a couple of things that I would like to share.
I just wanted to thank you. Thank NORRAG and the whole team of NORRAG once again. Thank you to the expert that really worked along with us in the research phase for the drafting of the study. So thank you very much. And thank you very much as well to all the experts, men and women, who took part in the work. Thank you to the civil society as well. And thank you to the academia, members of the academia who indeed were fully committed and really shared the information, their knowledge with me, with my team, so that all this information, so that all these ideas can be shared with the rest of the world. And as I said before, if I had to perhaps draw one conclusion as regards to the digitization of education, what I would say is, let's go back to basics. Let's just say once and for all that it's absolutely fundamental to think about the kind of society that we want. And on that basis, let's define the fundamental human values that we want to promote: living together, solidarity, recognition of each other, the recognition of each other's creativity and ability and knowledge and skills, the recognition of each other's cultures. If we accept those fundamental values, if we accept that we are part of this human society, of a fundamentally human society, then I believe that everyone at his or her level should play their role. But in order for that to happen, I say today that we need that the United Nations, that UNESCO organize spaces of dialogue so that we can talk about the issue of digitalization in the field of education, but also as related to other rights. We have to think of e-rights. This is really a concept that we're working on. We're not just talking about education in relation with digitalization. I believe that the whole wide world will have to engage in this debate. We need to have an international debate. We need to have a regional debate in Africa, in Europe, in Americas, in Oceania, but also at national level. We need to open up spaces for dialogue between the different stakeholders, whether private, the civil society, households, families, communities, learners, but also teachers. Let's give them all a space. Let's listen to one another. And let's focus especially on the learners. Let's give more autonomy to schools, to the literacy centers, to the knowledge centers. We need to listen to one another. If we can build those spaces for dialogue from the international to the local level, so that we can discuss about this, then we'll be on the right track. This is a society's phenomenon. We need to build safeguards. We're talking about mental health. We talk about a psychological burden as related to digitalization. But of course, there are the other challenges, environmental challenges, financial challenges, economic challenges, societal challenges, as we've seen before during this very meeting. All this is fundamental. So for me, we need to really take the time to open up a dialogue. Dialogue is the key word at all levels with all stakeholders. Thank you very much. And frankly, it'll be a pleasure to really meet again for other topics and to go on with this dialogue that's only just started now. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Kumbu, and thank you to all of your team, to Mylène and to Sti as well, who have been a pleasure to work with through this process. And so here, this is just an introduction to a policy insights briefing that we will soon be publishing, and we will send out the link to that with the event's highlights that we will be sharing with everyone who registered to this event. And as you can see from the contents, we've taken these 6 issues and we have some key contributions here, including from the speakers that we were very happy to hear from today. And the 6 themes are the 6 workshops that we organized with the expert consultations that we organized with a special rapporteur. And you can see that we're covering quite a lot of ground here. In addition, we would like to invite you, if you are not already a member of NORRAG's network, to join our network. You will find the connection in the chat right now. You can sign up to be a member, or if you're already a member, you can go in, find yourself, and find the other people inside the network who are useful to your work or that you're just interested in exchanging with, and we will be continuing that network work going forward. We also currently have a call for contributions out for a piece, a NORRAG, excuse me, special issue on the education, training and work continuums. If you are interested in this, please do follow the link that our team is now putting into the chat. And finally, the Global Education Monitoring Report for next year is on technology and education. And they currently have an online consultation going on. If you care enough about this issue to be here today, we would very much recommend that you go to that online consultation. Again, you'll find a link in the chat, and give your views also to the Global Education Monitoring Report to make sure that they are able to take those views into account. And finally, all participants will receive a follow-up email with the recordings and the event highlights. And do please let us know how we can improve the next event by filling in the evaluation form. And as I said before, do join the NORRAG network and really get to see not only the work that we do, but also the work of our 5,300 members that we are absolutely certain will be of interest to you. So thank you all very much for your attention today. Goodbye, everyone.